we are starting our next lesson on the 7 churches of Revelation, dealing with the geography, history and archaeology. And of course, as you can see on our first slide, we are dealing with the city of Thyatira. And so, of course, that passage which I'm going to preach and teach through next week is found in Revelation chapter 2, verses 18 to 29. So, Thyatira. So, starting off first, where is Thyatira? Now, as you can see here on this slide, it's over there on your right. Of course, remember, the book Revelation was written from the island of Patmos by the Apostle John. It was sent to Ephesus, the first church that we learned about, then Smyrna, then Pergamum, and then to Thyatira. So the 4th church that the Lord wrote to in Revelation. So the 4th church that John wrote to in the Revelation was the church at Thyatira. Now this is the longest letter in Revelation that was written to a local church. So this is one of the longest letters that he wrote to a church. Now, the funny thing is, even though it is the longest letter, we're going to see that this is one of the shortest lessons on the geography and the history and the archaeology of this particular city. And we're going to see why here in a few moments. Now, as with Pergamum and Smyrna, we know little about the origins of this local church. Now, the presumption is it was probably started around about the time when Paul was in Ephesus preaching the gospel, where the Bible says that all Asia, or the Roman province of Asia, Western day modern Turkey, heard the gospel. So that's the presumption we make. But by the time John wrote Revelation, towards the end of the 1st century AD, the church was in existence. Now, there is, as we're going to see, a modern day Turkish town on the location of the ancient city, and the modern town is called Archaeology. So you can go to the site. Now we're going to see it's not the most awe-inspiring place. In fact, the ancient site of Thyatira that you can see today is nestled in the middle of this modern city, and it encompasses about a space of a city block. So not a lot. So of course we learned about Smyrna, and we saw that relatively speaking that place, archaeological site, is not very big. Well, Thyatira is even smaller, and there's even a lot less to see. So, now, the geography of Thyatira. So the city of Thyatira, which means odour of affliction, was located in Lydia within the Roman province of Asia. And so you can see that there where the star is on your slide. So further inland than, say, Smyrna or Ephesus or Pergamum. But yet we're going to see a little bit about where this city came from here in a moment. Now, it was located about halfway between Pergamos and Sardis on a major highway. So you can even see here on the map, there's Pergamum, or Pergamos as the King James calls it, and here is the city of Sardis, which we'll learn about in a couple of weeks. Now, there was this important highway that went between these two cities. And in fact, there was another one that went from west to east too. So you could say it was located in a very strategic location for, of course, travel through what is now modern day Western Turkey. So, the town was landlocked about 50 miles from the sea. So as you can see on the map, it's quite a distance away from the sea. It's about the distance, from Dublin to here. And of course, Dublin's at the sea, and we're, of course, getting close to the middle of the country of Ireland. So it's landlocked, which isn't surprising, as we're going to see. The rest of the cities are also landlocked. But, however, it became a vital centre of commerce and trade based on its location on the major trade routes. Now, we saw previously that cities like Ephesus and Smyrna were important because they were located on the sea. So here, this city is not located on the sea. It's landlocked, 50 miles away from the sea. But because of its strategic location on these major highways, it could take advantage of the trade that was passing from north to south and from east to west. So even though it lacked access to the sea, yet it was still vitally important. And especially economically, because trade would be flowing through this region, whether it was going inland into Turkey, what is Turkey today, or it was going to the sea, or wherever. So there's multiple reasons why cities are important. So just because it wasn't on the sea doesn't mean it wasn't important. Now, this influenced the town's development, as we're going to see. Now, little of the ancient town remains, as the modern town is situated directly on top of the old, and therefore most of the ancient city is not accessible to archaeologists. So you can see here on the right here, this is just one of the pictures, there's not very many of them, of ancient Thyatira. But you notice here what the site is surrounded by? Apartment blocks. And it's surrounded by them. So literally, this is actually quite close to the end of the site. So you go back a little further behind where I took this picture. Over there, you can see a picture of part of the Roman road here, going through. Here's the remains of the stoa. You can see the columns and the arches that would have lined the side of this road. There was an arch there too. So that's one of, you could say, the amazing things you can see in Thyatira. And you know what? There's one more thing you can basically see, and that's about it. So, like I said, you go to some of these places where the 7 churches are located, say like Ephesus, or Pergamum, or like Sardis, or even Laodicea, and you're just blown away by what you see. Thyatira is, to be honest, quite underwhelming. Well, because the modern town is situated on top of it. So presumably, if you knock that apartment block down there, at the end of the picture, then guess what? You'd find more. But, you know, there's people living in there, and, you know, they probably like living in there, or if they don't, they just have to live there for one reason or another. They won't like having their homes knocked down, so you can just extend the archaeological site a little bit more. So you see the thing here. Now, if in time the building has to be demolished or something has to change, maybe they'll be able to access more. So archaeology is a continual work in progress. And that progress could take centuries. And that's the thing with archaeology. Even in well-known sites like Ephesus, there are still major archaeological digs and excavations going on at Ephesus to this very day. And in fact, they estimate it could take centuries to excavate the site. That's even if they do, because it takes time and money and effort, which are oftentimes limited, and expertise. So, Thyatira, not one of the most overwhelming sites, but nonetheless, it's a place you can go and see. I've been there, I've ticked it off my bucket list. But anyway, what's left in the site, where you can see the modern apartment blocks in the distance, this is part of what's left of a later Roman basilica building, which was acted as sort of one of the government centres in a Roman city. Of course, later on, Roman basilicas were often converted into churches. That's where you get the idea of basilica church. But a basilica was actually a Roman government building before that. Why did later Christians take these buildings and convert them into church buildings? Well, because they're pretty convenient places to do that with. So you can even see here, there's the apse of the rounded end of the basilica. So you can see you could fit a lot of people into this building. So once it was primarily a Roman governmental building, but then used later on for early church buildings. Now, not in the 1st century or the 2nd century. In that period, presumably all churches were located in houses or in rented properties. But then later on, with, of course, the influence of Christianity growing, and then with, of course, Constantine the Great making Christianity the state religion, increased, you could say, the need and the desire for official church buildings. And of course, we believe churches are not buildings, they're the people. So this is what you can see. So that's the major things you can see. Part of a road, part of a store, remains of an arch, and then also the inside of this basilica. That's about it. There's a few inscriptions. That's it. So like I said, not a lot to see, but yet we do know some history about Thyatira. Now, what is the history of this site? Well, little is known about the earliest settlements located at Thyatira. Now, we do know that there were people living there, but we do not know very much about them until, in fact, up to the Greek period. In fact, till the Macedonians controlled the region. Now, the Roman historian Pliny the Younger suggested an earlier Lydian town called Pelopia existed where Thyatira was situated. So there were people living there, but we just don't really know much about them. Now, you may say, well, why didn't they write more history about it? Well, because Thyatira, in the grand scheme of things, wasn't the most important place. Why is there a lot written about Ephesus? Well, because it was the capital of the Roman province of Asia. Smyrna was famous for its connection with certain people, and it was a major port. Also, Pergamus. Pergamus was, of course, once the Roman provincial capital. So that's why they write a lot about these things. But if it's sort of a relative backwater and an unimportant place, they're just not going to write a lot. And remember, most of the histories that we have are fragmentary. We do not have the complete histories that were written in the ancient world because they haven't survived. So there's a lot we know, but there's an awful lot we don't know. Now, over time, more could come to light. In fact, at the moment, of course, even in Pompeii, they're using new techniques to read papyrus scrolls that were, of course, literally turned into like ash nearly. And they were literally almost like, you could say for what better words, like fossilized. And now they're scanning them, and now they're able to read the text that is within these carbonized scrolls, one by one. And it's a big achievement, it's a big accomplishment. They're using AI now to read cuneiform texts. So, which is going to put some scholars out of business when an AI program can read a tablet and you don't need them anymore. That's life, isn't it, though? You get put out of business by these things. It's great until you don't have a job. But anyway, Pliny writes a little bit about it. We don't know much beside that. Now, it was not until the 3rd century BC under Seleucus I of the Nicator of the Seleucid Empire did Thyatira come into existence, as we know of it, as a Macedonian colony. Now, what do I mean by a colony? Well, in other words, in the ancient world, if you wanted to kill two birds with one stone, you have an army who needs to retire, but you also have a region that might be troublesome politically and that might be prone to revolt. Well, what would happen in some cases, especially later on with Rome, you would found what was known as a colony. So in other words, take for instance Rome. If you've done your service in the Roman legions, whether in the Republic or later on in the Empire, and you've done your service for how many years, you could be either given land or you could be given money. And so one of the ways you could please your retirees is you'd give them land. And one of the things they would do is they would found what were known as colonies. Now, what the colony was there for was to basically pay up the veterans who had retired. You'd give them maybe a house in the town and give them a parcel of land outside of the town, or you could maybe just give them a parcel of land and they could have a house there. So you could pay them that way, and multiple veterans would take over that region. But also too, you imagine if you're in a troublesome area where the locals may not be happy that you control it. Well, if you found a town that's full of loyal veterans, then guess what? That might discourage anyone else in the area from thinking of rising up and rebelling. Why? Because if this town is full of veterans who are ready to defend their ruler because who's given them this reward and who's been loyal and who's been faithful to them, then ultimately these guys could decide to take up arms and counter any insurrection or rebellion. So in essence, it does two things at once. It kills two birds with one stone. It gives people a retirement, and it also makes a base or a centre that discourages potential rebellions. Now remember, this is a Macedonian colony. So these were Macedonian soldiers who were given this city as a colony with its lands, not the local Lydian population, which implies there might have been some issues of friction So that's what a colony is. Much later on, you see Rome does this prolifically, even throughout Italy, even throughout the entire Roman Empire. It's a good way of dealing with two problems at once, and it was very effective. For instance, I'll give you another example. The city of Philippi, of course, where the Epistle to the Philippians is written, was a Roman colony city, refounded as a Roman colony. It existed previously, but it was made into a colony. So, you've learned a little bit about Roman political wranglings, and also about how ancient soldiers sometimes received their retirements if they lived that long. So it was a Macedonian colony. Now, later on, the town became a part of the kingdom of Pergamum, which we, of course, learn about in relation to the city of Pergamos. Now, under the Attalid dynasty in 189 BC. So it switched hands. It had been under the control of the Seleucids, and then it came under the control of the kingdom of Pergamum, under the Attalid dynasty. Then we saw that with the bequeathing of the kingdom of Pergamum to Rome in 133 BC, remember we learned about that the last king of the kingdom of Pergamum, Attalid III, he just gave the entirety of his kingdom to Rome in his will. Don't know the exact reasons. Maybe he just saw, hey, why go against the flow? Rome's the big boy on the block, and it would just be better for let them have it, because they're probably going to want it, and at least they'll treat us well, which is what happened. Now, the town became a part of the new Roman province of Asia in 129 BC. So, relatively speaking, we don't know a huge amount about the history of Thyatira. We don't know much about the archaeology of it. We don't know much about the history. But yet, this is what we know. So, like I said, what we have both physically and historically is often very fragmentary. Could be more come up later on. That's always the hope. But, I've said this before. Archaeology is the study of basically what is durable rubbish. Yeah, the fragments of scrolls or the scrolls we have are basically the rubbish that survived. The remains you see at these sites are just the durable stuff that survived the destructions, and it's became, well, for want of better words, rubbish. However, the city later became a Roman garrison town, so, obviously the Romans also had issues with the local population, or potentially threats from further afield. So the Romans made a garrison town there, though the town was most famous for its industry. So it was famous for being a colony, it was famous for being a Roman garrison town, but it was famous more for its economic activity, or the industry that went on there. Now, many inscriptions found in or around the town point to industries like tanners, leather workers, dyers, wool workers, linen workers, potters, bakers, slave traders, and coppersmiths being present in the town. Now, there's probably more than that, but this is what we know of, so that's a good few there. Now, in any large town, you may have this variety of work of craftsmen there, but apparently in Thyatira there was an awful lot more of them. So it's sort of like in any town. Some towns you get that may be relatively big, but they don't have a lot of industry, and then you get some towns that are just full of industry. Thyatira was apparently one of them. Now, each trade also apparently had its own respective guild in the town. How do we know that? Well, because we found many different inscriptions, say for instance this one here and others, that mention the guilds of the town. So it's sort of like, the ancient version of a modern day trade union. Of course, you have trade unions that represent doctors or nurses or shop assistants or whoever, fill in the blanks. There's trade unions galore. Now, you may say, well, that's great. So these businessmen had a way of banding together for both political and economic support. And there's advantages to trade unions or guilds. But as we're going to see, there could also be disadvantages to it. Because modern day trade unions have agendas politically, but in the ancient world they had agendas too, but they also had religious agendas. And you may say, what? Trade unions or a guild being religious? Well, in the ancient world, you've got to remember this, there is no notion of separating the secular from the religious. The church and the state were united. Everything had its religious aspect. You had trades which would have their own patron gods, for instance. So the fact of the matter is, there was no idea of, oh, here, this is secular and this is religious, and they don't come together. It was intimately connected one to another. The idea of, separation of, say, church or state or business and religion, that's only a relatively new kid on the block. We take it as granted, but that wasn't how it has been for an awful long time. However, these trade guilds for a Christian businessman had both benefits and dangers. And you may say, how so? Well, we'll see in a moment. Textile and dyeing industries seem to have the largest presence in the town. How do we know that? Well, based upon the amount of inscriptions we know of. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't other big industries in the town, but from what inscriptions and epigraphic evidence, they seem to be the most. Well, because they have the most inscriptions, so that implies something. But like I said, that's based on a fragmentary record. They could find loads more and find out, well, actually, the coppersmiths were far more numerous in the town than the dyers or the textile workers. We don't know. That could change. We don't know. But we know they were popular. And we know there was a lot of them. Now, the archaeological evidence for the importance of the dyeing and textile industry in the town helps to support an event recorded in the scripture. Now, you may not be aware of this, but you can see that the book of Acts and Revelation are connected. You may say, how so? Well, in Acts chapter 16, verse 14, the Bible tells us that one of the first converts that Paul had in Philippi, in Macedonia, in other words, in Europe, was a wealthy business lady called Lydia. So there's the person Lydia, and there's the area called Lydia, who came from Thyatira. The Bible states that Lydia, who sold purple dye, that doesn't mean that she bought the liquid around and sold the liquid. She was a seller of purple garments. In other words, purple dye. She came from Thyatira. Her business was that of selling expensive purple dyed garments. Now, the primary way of making purple dye in the ancient world, the most reliable way, because ancient dyeing methods were not always 100% reliable. Now today, look, for a bit of, I didn't mean this, but notice I'm wearing this lovely purpley colour tie. But the thing is, that's using synthetic dyes, that's consistent. But with natural dyes, it can vary. You can use the same materials, but you dye one garment and it's like, oh, that's a really rich purple. And this is not so. And this may even come out reddy. That can even happen. And so it can be inconsistent. But the two main ingredients that were used for purple dye were, firstly, the major one that most people know of was using what is called the murex. It's a little crustacean that lived in the sea. And you take this little snail and you do horrible things to it. You crush it and you goo it up. It was a very dirty, smelly, disgusting job. In fact, ancient authors would say, you were coming near the dyeing section of a town where literally you could smell it. And pardon the pun, they're probably dying from the smell. Oh, pardon the pun there. I don't like puns, yeah, I know. I'm not fond of puns myself, but anyway. But you could smell it. It was a very dirty business. But it made purple dye. And they literally killed many millions of these little snails, sea snails, to get purple dye. But another way that could be used to get purple dye was to use the local root known as the madder root. Now, some people say, well, did Lydia just import Murex dye to her place, or did she use the madder route, or was it a bit... Look, one way or another, she did it. Whether it was just using the root or using the Murex snails as dye, she did it one way or another. You know, that's academia for us. Sometimes they argue about little trivial things to the death. But anyway, so we see this here. So wouldn't it be surprising if we learn, or based on the historical and archaeological record, that Thyatira had no evidence of a textile or dyeing industry? But the Bible, and then people would say, well, look here. The Bible says that Lydia came from Thyatira and she sold purple garments. But yet Thyatira, there's no evidence of that. Now, that would seem pretty bad, but remember, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So in other words, but yet we see here what happened. What happened? They discovered that this town where Lydia came from was full of this industry. And not surprising, Lydia, for one reason or another, went off to Macedonia. She gets saved. And you know what? Maybe she came back to Thyatira. We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. So is it possible that maybe Lydia helped to found the church there? Yeah, it's possible. We just don't know. But the fact is, you can see how the Bible is remarkably accurate even in little details. Lydia was from Thyatira and she was seller of purple. The archaeological record tells us that this town was famous for its purple production and for its textiles. So all these little teeny-weeny things are very important. It's the little details that are often most important. Now, the archaeological evidence directly supports what the Bible tells us about Lydia. Little details count. It's easy to fake the big things. It's not so easy to fake the little things. Some think that maybe Lydia later had a hand in helping to start the church there. The town became extremely wealthy from its location on the trade routes and its numerous businesses and industries. Little remains of that affluence and importance today. More may be discovered later. So, you know, here we see parts of columns found within the town. And you can obviously even tell by the amount of well-worked stone structures in the town. Now, these structures were often not built at the expense of the government. They were often built by local important men or women for the benefit of the town and also for potentially for their own business and for their own political agendas. So a lot of these structures were not built by the government. They were built by important individuals, which implies the place had to have money. See, not all towns were equal, you could say, within the Roman Empire. If you had a lot of industry and a lot of wealthy people there, you can expect much higher class construction. So maybe more will be discovered, hopefully. One can only wait and see. Unsurprisingly, the town was also a centre of pagan idol worship. So not surprising, that goes with most ancient cities. The chief deity of the town was Apollo, who was worshipped as the sun god. He was often represented with flaming rays and feet of brass. So that's just one way he was depicted. Apollo could be depicted in multiple ways wherever you were. Now, interestingly, the Lord's description of himself in Revelation 2:18 would seem to show the superiority of Christ over the town's favourite god. Because in other words, he's describing himself in a similar way to Apollo, but he's also saying, well, look here, I'm better than him. If he can do that, I tell you what, he may think he's doing that, but I'm the real one. I'm better than Apollo. So interesting that this town, this is how they depicted him. But yet Christ, in the book of Revelation, writing to this church, describes himself in a similar fashion. And in essence implying, I am superior than your chief local deity, Apollo. Other gods were worshipped in the town, like the Sibyl and the imperial cult and so on. In other words, the worship of the emperors. You know, they were just common, especially in the Roman Empire. Now, Unlike modern trade guilds, each trade guild had their own patron god, which isn't surprising in the ancient world. It was common, therefore, for members of a guild to seemingly meet in their god's temple and celebrate by eating food offered to their god and then engaging in sexual immorality. Now, it probably depended on the god you were worshipping, but whether you were literally committing immorality or just eating food offered to an idol, there's problems there. This would be an obvious temptation or danger for a Christian business owner in the town. You may say, well, how so? Well, say if you're wanting to set up your own textile or dyeing industry in Thyatira and you're a Christian. Well, the best way to get your business off the ground is to join the guild, because they can help you. They can maybe give you support politically or potentially even financially, which is good, isn't it? You need that when you're starting up a business, because most businesses will, for the first while, only make a loss until they start making a profit. That's generally how it goes. But that's good. But then if you're a Christian and you're a business owner, and then they're saying, okay, we're going to have to meet in our local patron god's temple. Okay. And you know what? At our meetings, we offer meat and food that's been offered to the idol. Okay. And you know, afterwards, we have some fun. You see the problem there? But yet, for instance, even in modern day businesses, you know, if say you join a company, they encourage you to do what? Join the trade union. But if you don't, in some ways that puts you in a disadvantage. And a lot of times they may pressure you to join it. And if you don't, well, they might at the very least frown upon you. Or, you know, their bases say, well, you're not getting any help from us, good luck. Now, they don't force you, but, you know, it comes with disadvantages if you don't join. Well, the same would be true here. You're a Christian, you're trying to set up a business. The logical thing is to join the trade guild, but there's moral issues. So what do? You either don't join the guild and you miss out on the network they have and the political and the financial support that they have, or you join the guild, but yet you're required to meet in their god's temple and eat their food and, well, potentially doing things you shouldn't be doing. You can see the issue. And we're going to see that Thyatira had its issues as a church. And apparently, if this is a wealthy town, they would have people in the church who were wealthy. I'm sure in any church there's the more wealthy, maybe the middle class, those who are poor. But this church had its issues. And so we wonder, well, did this have to do with joining the guilds? So you can see the problems. Some or all of these spiritual dangers, the Sibyl, the imperial cult, pagan guilds, may be what brought about the presence of a false prophetess named Jezebel in the local church, and the result in idolatry and immorality. Now, Jezebel may just be a nickname. Well, you know, if there's literally a woman called Jezebel there in the church, that wouldn't be a very good name to have, would it? Would it be like calling your son Ahab? You know. But it's probably more likely a nickname just given to her. Why would you call someone nicknamed Jezebel? Because Jezebel was the wicked queen of Ahab, who did what? Led Ahab further astray in the worship of Baal. And so we can see here that we don't know all the details, but one way or another we know that there are spiritual issues in this town. And we know from what the Bible says that there were issues within this church with people like this Jezebel influencing the church members to do that which was wrong. So we can see there are issues. Did it have to do with the trade guilds? Did it have to do with something else? We don't know it entirely. But based upon what we know, this is highly plausible. And here you can see here this picture. Of course, this is a picture of the Emperor Augustus and a depiction of the Sibyl on your right. So fact of the matter is, this would be a good inference to make as to what was going on. So, in conclusion, The importance of Thyatira as an economic and industrial centre in Asia brought about great wealth to the town. It was a wealthy place. However, this also seemingly influenced the local church members there through involvement in pagan trade guilds and other pagan practices, so as to tolerate a false prophetess, idolatry and immorality within their church membership. This brought about the Lord's rebuke and a warning of judgment upon those involved in such practices, which we're going to look at next week in my sermon on the letter written to Thyatira. But for now, we're going to end it there.